It all began when I bought a peaceful lakefront property to escape the chaos of city life, a place where I could finally enjoy my mornings with the sound of water lapping against my private dock. The lake was calm, the air was fresh, and for the first few months, everything was exactly how I had dreamed it would be. I invested a good amount of money into building a high-end floating dock, complete with solar lighting, sturdy railings, and even a little bench area for fishing or sipping bourbon at sunset. It was more than a dock. It was my sanctuary, my slice of heaven. But then came Karen. Her house was 4 doors down, and I first noticed her because of the aggressive way she pruned a community hedge and glared at anyone who parked even slightly crooked on the shared road. She introduced herself within the first week of me moving in, not with a pie or a friendly welcome, but with a printed copy of the HOA regulations and a passive-aggressive smile that could sour milk. "We take our neighborhood rules seriously around here," she said, as if it were a warning. I nodded, pretending to care, because my lot was technically outside the jurisdiction of the HOA. I wasn't on their road, didn't share their communal areas, and my dock wasn't listed in their blueprints, something I made sure of before buying the property. But Karen didn't like that. No, she didn't like anything she couldn't control. At first, it was small stuff. She'd report my unauthorized plant species to the HOA board, even though, again, I wasn't under their governance. She took photos of my solar lights and sent them to the neighborhood group chat, saying they were a fire hazard. She even once accused my dog of barking with malicious intent. Malicious intent. It was both hilarious and disturbing how deep her delusions ran. I kept my distance, always staying polite, always keeping receipts. Because Karen wasn't just a busybody. She was a manipulator with a clipboard and a vendetta. Then came the wedding. I got a hint something weird was up when I noticed a tent rental truck parked near her driveway, and then a group of guys assembling something that suspiciously resembled a wedding arch. The kicker. The next morning, I wake up to find that my dock, my private dock, has been decorated with white ribbons, lanterns, and little glass jars filled with baby's breath. My dock had been hijacked. Confused and furious, I marched down there only to find a literal wedding rehearsal happening. Karen, in all her glory, wearing a headset and clipboard, directing people like she was Steven Spielberg shooting Bridal Wars. I asked her, calmly but firmly, what in the name of floating madness she thought she was doing. She acted shocked. "Oh, I assumed since your dock is part of the lake and the lake is public that it was fair game." I reminded her very slowly that while the lake is public, the dock is not. It's private property paid for with private funds, and it legally floats on a tethered anchoring system that I own and maintain. She smiled and said, "Well, it's just for a few hours. It's my daughter's special day. You're not going to ruin it over something silly, are you?" Silly. She called stealing my dock silly. I wanted to call the cops then and there, but something inside me said, no. Be patient. Be diabolical. I walked away without another word, watching her hand out champagne samples on my property like she was the queen of the marina. And that's when the idea hit me. My dock was built to float. It wasn't just anchored, it had a release mechanism for emergencies, allowing it to drift if needed. What if I gave Karen the wedding cruise of a lifetime? I waited. I planned. I made sure everything I needed was ready. Because if she thought she could hijack my sanctuary, she was going to learn the hard way what happens when you mess with someone who reads their contracts and owns a boat motor with remote controls. The morning of the wedding was suspiciously quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. I woke up at 5 a.m., not because I wanted to, but because Karen's cousin or nephew or some other loud tank top wearing wedding helper decided to test the sound system on my dock. The bass shook my bedroom window and the DJ shouted, "Check 1, 2, let's get married," like this was a spring break rave and not a lakeside ceremony. I watched from my window, sipping coffee and pretending to yawn, all while my hand rested on a small black remote. It was the control for the emergency release motor I'd installed on the dock 6 months ago, originally designed in case of flooding. The mechanism could unlatch the mooring lines, fire up the trolling motor, and gently guide the dock out onto the open water. Karen didn't know that. Karen didn't know anything except how to hijack things she didn't own and call it community spirit. By noon, the guests were arriving in waves. Fancy cars lined the gravel road, some even parked partially on my grass. I saw an entire bridal party laughing and clinking mimosas on my dock, shoes off, champagne flowing. There were candles. There were floral arrangements. There was even a violinist tuning up under a rented pergola someone had zip-tied to my bench. It was, to their credit, beautiful, but illegally and offensively beautiful. Karen stood proudly by the entrance in a pearl-studded blazer, handing out programs like she had just brokered peace in the Middle East. When I approached her one last time and said, "Karen, I'll give you 10 minutes to wrap this up," she patted my arm condescendingly and said, "It's just a dock, don't be dramatic." And with that, the remote in my hand clicked on. The motors under the dock hummed softly, too soft for most to notice over the violin and murmured conversations. The dock shuddered slightly, a shift subtle enough to seem like wind. Then it began to move. Inch by inch, it pulled away from the shore, drifting slowly but steadily toward the middle of the lake. At first, no one noticed. They were too busy posing for Instagram. But when one of the groomsmen looked up from his phone and saw shoreline slipping away, his drink nearly fell from his hand. Panic bloomed like algae in July. People scrambled. Some screamed. A flower girl started crying. The violinist, bless his heart, kept playing through the chaos like a professional on the Titanic. Karen, standing on land, turned to see her daughter, the groom, and 70 guests floating away from her in stunned silence. Her face twisted, half horror, half confusion, all Karen. She shrieked my name as though I had just committed grand theft ceremony. "You sabotaged my daughter's wedding," she wailed. "This is illegal. This is kidnapping." I calmly waved the deed to the dock from my porch. "No, it's private property. You trespassed. I'm just letting my dock go for a swim. Totally within my rights." A local fisherman on his rowboat laughed so hard he nearly capsized. The dock floated further, coming to a gentle stop in the middle of the lake thanks to the GPS limiter I'd programmed. There, surrounded by water, with guests too afraid to jump and too overdressed to swim, the wedding party stood frozen. The officiant still had the mic and tried to continue, but no one was paying attention. Karen threatened to sue, to call the Coast Guard, the mayor, the Pope, anyone. I told her I'd be happy to bring the dock back after the event was over. I even offered to shuttle people out there in my canoe, for a modest fee. Eventually, a few brave souls took off their shoes and swam back. Others called their boat-owning friends. Some just stayed, resigned, muttering about how they knew something like this would happen the moment they heard the phrase "Karen's in charge." The bride, to her credit, tried to stay calm, but by the time the cake tipped over and someone dropped an iPhone into the lake, she was sitting cross-legged on the dock, muttering something about eloping to Vegas. That evening, after the sun went down and the last guest had been evacuated, I motored the dock back in. Slowly, with style. I stood there in my robe, holding a flashlight like a guiding beacon, the word karma practically radiating off my grin. Karen was nowhere to be seen. She'd fled, probably to draft up another useless complaint to the HOA about how private doesn't mean not hers. But me. I slept better than I had in years. After the chaos of the floating wedding, things went eerily quiet for about 3 days. Too quiet. I knew Karen well enough by now to know she wasn't the type to sulk. No, Karen was a schemer, a long-game player, the kind of person who turns petty grievances into epic vendettas. So I waited. I kept the dock locked up, changed the security codes on my motor remote, and installed a few extra cameras around the perimeter. I even put up a modest sign that read, "Private property. Unauthorized use will result in public embarrassment." But the peace didn't last. On the 4th day, I came home from a grocery run to find a neon orange notice taped to my front door. Code violation. Unauthorized structure over public waterway. It was official letterhead, signed by some no-name HOA bureaucrat with Karen's fingerprints all over it. This was rich. The HOA was trying to find me over a structure that, one, was on land not governed by them, two, floated entirely on my private anchoring system, and three, had been illegally commandeered by them. I laughed. Out loud. Karen, apparently, had gone to the HOA board with a sob story about how her daughter's wedding was nearly drowned due to unapproved modifications on a public access structure. Her logic was laughable, but the board was full of her drinking buddies, so of course they backed her. Within a week, I had a court summons in my mailbox and an HOA inspector wandering around my yard with a clipboard, acting like he was hunting for radioactive spiders. I confronted him, and he mumbled something about community aesthetics before tripping over a garden gnome and leaving. I knew what I had to do. I called my lawyer, Rick, a bulldog in a suit who specialized in small-town nonsense. Rick went straight to the county zoning office and got documentation proving my dock was 100% outside the HOA's authority. But Rick didn't stop there. He suggested something better. Let's countersue for harassment, trespassing, and attempted property theft. Music to my ears. We filed the paperwork, attached drone footage of the wedding on my dock, and included screenshots of Karen's public Facebook posts bragging about how we made the dock look so romantic, like a floating Pinterest board. It was legal gold. Word got out fast. Our little lawsuit became the biggest scandal on the lake since Old Man Pritchard got caught skinny dipping behind the marina. Karen's supporters shrank faster than her credibility. The court date was set, and by the time we got there, Karen had turned into a different person. No pearls, no clipboard, just a trembling woman in a beige cardigan with bags under her eyes and a shaky voice. She tried to spin the story as a misunderstanding, saying she thought the dock was part of the communal water feature. The judge raised an eyebrow, so high I thought it would escape orbit. Rick handed over the evidence packet like he was delivering a gourmet meal. After 20 minutes of review, the judge ruled in my favor. The HOA has no jurisdiction over property in question. The plaintiff is awarded damages for trespassing, defamation, and legal fees. I won. I didn't just win. I slam-dunked her clipboard into legal oblivion. Karen was ordered to pay over $18,000 in damages and write a formal apology letter, which I had framed and hung right above my fishing pole rack. The HOA had to retract their violation notice and issue a community memo clarifying the limits of their authority. Karen didn't show her face for 2 weeks. When she finally emerged, she avoided eye contact with every neighbor and took her dog out at 5 a.m. like she was sneaking through enemy territory. But here's the kicker. About a month later, a real estate agent showed up at her house with a for sale sign. Karen was moving. Rumor had it she was going to live with her sister across the state, someplace with stricter bylaws and more submissive neighbors. Good riddance. To celebrate, I hosted a dock party, my dock, my rules. We grilled burgers, played yacht rock classics, and handed out fake HOA citations as drink coasters. It was glorious. And when someone asked me what happened to Karen, I just smiled and said, she drifted off into the sunset, just like my dock. With Karen officially out of the picture, I expected the lake to return to its peaceful, free rhythm. The birds chirped louder. The fish swam freer. I even saw the cranky raccoon behind my shed give me what I swear was a thumbs up. The neighbors were friendlier too. Turns out, no one really liked Karen, they were just too scared to cross her. Without her reign of clipboard terror, people began hosting BBQs, sharing tools, and even complimenting each other's lawn gnomes instead of reporting them. But of course, peace in an HOA-controlled neighborhood is like a snowman in July. It melts fast. Enter Denise. Blonde, Botoxed, and bursting with artificial charm, Denise moved into Karen's old house like she was the next contestant on Real Housewives of Lakeside Estates. She introduced herself with a homemade batch of gluten-free muffins and a brochure she'd personally designed titled, Community Improvements, A Fresh Start. I knew right then we were in trouble. Denise was a new-era Karen, one that smiled while gutting your freedoms with a bedazzled pruning saw. She claimed she wasn't like her predecessor, insisting she believed in collaboration and open dialogue, but her first act as HOA board member was to suggest a dock standardization initiative. That's right. She wanted every dock on the lake to look the same color, same materials, same size. My dock, she said with a tight grin, was too individualized and made others feel excluded. I laughed so hard I almost fell off the pier. You mean the same dock your house tried to steal for a wedding? I asked. She didn't flinch. Exactly. It made people feel like they weren't welcome to enjoy the lake equally. This time, I wasn't playing defense. I brought out the documents again, those glorious county files that proved, once more, that my dock was outside HOA jurisdiction. I also reminded her politely that I still had legal leverage from the previous lawsuit, and that poking the bear might not end well. Denise backed off for a bit, but she wasn't done. Instead of a direct attack, she tried the passive-aggressive route. One morning, I found a freshly painted community bulletin board installed right at the edge of my property line. On it, laminated notices with things like, please consider lowering the volume of your fishing music and avoid bright lighting after 7 p.m. to preserve lake serenity. I replied by installing a neon sign that read, Lake Serenity ends here. Denise didn't take the hint. She tried to host a dock beautification meeting and slipped flyers into everyone's mailbox, except mine. Unfortunately for her, what my neighbor's Greg handed me a copy while chuckling. Greg had never liked the HOA either, and after the dock incident, he was firmly on team don't mess with my dock. I decided to attend the meeting. Oh yes, I showed up, clipboard in hand, wearing a t-shirt that said #DocBoss. The look on Denise's face when I sat in the front row was worth every legal fee I'd ever paid. She tried to pretend everything was fine, giving a rehearsed speech about a unified aesthetic vision for shared water space. I raised my hand and asked if she'd measured how many HOA members owned docks on non-HOA property. She stumbled. I then offered to bring a county assessor to the next meeting to explain the difference between shared space and private land usage. The meeting fell apart like a toddler-built Jenga tower. People started arguing about how much power the HOA actually had. It became clear most residents didn't want more rules. They just wanted to be left alone. Denise adjourned early, blaming unproductive energy and saying she needed to consult with legal advisors. I waved goodbye with the same hand I used to press the motor control the day her spiritual predecessor got an involuntary lake cruise. From that moment, Denise kept her distance. She still posted passive-aggressive notes and tried to coordinate kayak cleanups at inconvenient times, but she knew better than to touch my dock or anything near it. I continued to enjoy my floating paradise, sipping bourbon on my bench, fishing in peace. The dock had become more than wooden bolts. It was a monument to personal freedom, HOA resilience, and the power of letting idiots defeat themselves with their own nonsense. By the time Denise retreated into passive aggression and scented community emails, I thought things had finally simmered down. But what I didn't expect was that my little rebellion, my refusal to surrender my dock to HOA tyranny, would spark something far bigger than I anticipated. It started small. Greg, my neighbor and now full-time ally in the war on nonsense, came over one evening with a six-pack and a wild grin. "You started something, man," he said. I thought he meant I'd inspired him to repaint his fence without HOA approval or something equally trivial. But no, he meant revolution. A few neighbors had formed a group chat called Free the Lake. Within 2 weeks, it had over 40 members. People were sharing stories, Karen yelling at someone for having unsanctioned wind chimes, Denise asking a retiree to replace her ceramic flamingos with something more coastal modern. Everyone had a Karen or Denise story, and suddenly my dock was more than just a private property line. It was a symbol. That's how the dock party was born. Not a literal party, at least not at first, but a political movement to overthrow the existing HOA leadership and replace them with people who, had actual neighbors instead of enemies. Greg nominated me for president. I laughed hard. But then I realized, why not? If they're going to harass me over my own floating deck, I might as well take the helm and steer the whole ship into better waters. I accepted on the condition that our campaign slogans were petty, hilarious, and brutally honest. So we made buttons that read "Dock the Vote" and shirts that said "Karen took my dock, so I took her seat." We held meetings on my dock. Yes, literally. I installed more solar lights, brought in lawn chairs, and hosted the first campaign rally with burgers and a cooler full of beer. The dock that had once hosted a hijacked wedding was now the birthplace of insurrection. It was beautiful. Denise caught wind of it, of course. She tried to shut us down with an emergency HOA memo claiming we were inciting discord. We printed copies of it, laminated them, and used them as coasters at our next dock gathering. People started pulling up in kayaks and canoes just to listen in. One guy, Steve from 2 blocks over, even paddled over in a giant inflatable flamingo with a megaphone to yell, "Down with HOA tyranny." We called him Admiral Steve from then on. His wife brought banana bread. The vibe was electric. Election day came faster than expected. Denise thought she could coast on name recognition and scare tactics, but she underestimated just how sick people were of her clipboard dictatorship. Greg ran for treasurer. Steve ran for naval coordinator, which wasn't a real position, but nobody cared because his flamingo was majestic. I somehow became the face of the resistance. The votes rolled in. It was a landslide. We won every position except community garden liaison, which Denise barely held onto because, in her words, she had superior tomato energy. Fine. Keep your tomatoes, Denise. As newly elected HOA president, my first act was to pass the Leave People Alone Unless They're Actively Starting Fires Act. We rolled back ridiculous regulations, turned the community newsletter into a meme-filled masterpiece, and updated the HOA bylaws to include a clause forbidding unsolicited dock usage. I even declared a neighborhood holiday, Dock Independence Day. We celebrated it with a floating barbecue, tiki torches, and a band playing yacht rock covers from a rented pontoon. Karen's old house was still on the market, by the way. Rumor was people kept backing out when they saw the commemorative plaque we installed at the end of my dock that read, "Here drifted the boldest wedding in HOA history." With power finally in the hands of people who actually gave a damn about community and sanity, the vibe of the neighborhood changed completely. People smiled more. Parties happened organically. Kids played outside without someone threatening to fine them for sidewalk chalk. My dock became a community haven, but with consent this time. And it wasn't just symbolic. It became the literal gathering place for our monthly meetings, fishing contests, and bourbon tastings. Even local news got wind of it. They did a segment titled, "From Chaos to Community, How One Man's Dock Floated into Freedom." And yes, I wore my #DockBoss shirt for the interview. It's funny how a floating platform built for fishing and sunset watching turned into the battleground for community autonomy, petty drama, and eventual revolution. A year after the infamous wedding drift incident, my dock had become more than wood and metal. It had transformed into a legend. We'd survived 2 HOA uprisings, weaponized remote-controlled motors, and turned bureaucracy into a punchline. Life around the lake had completely shifted. There were no more weaponized newsletters, no more surprise inspections by clipboard-wielding tyrants. What there was peace, and barbecues, and a community that now functioned like neighbors, not tenants in a cult. The dock stayed busy. On weekends, it hosted everything from open mic nights to poker tournaments to early morning yoga taught by Greg's wife, who swore that sun salutations hit different on water. They did. The community spirit that bloomed after the uprising wasn't perfect, but was real. People looked out for each other. There were still disagreements. Of course, someone always thinks their dog is better than yours, and Steve's inflatable flamingo did once knock over a toddler. But we had structure, we had laughter, and most importantly, we had self-governance. When people asked how it all started, I just pointed the plaque bolted into the dock that read, "Here lies the dream of Karen's control. May forever drift." Karen, last I heard, had become a regional manager at a gated retirement community 2 states over. Good. Let her patrol bingo night with a fury she once saved for backyard fire pits. Denise stuck around, begrudgingly, watering her tomatoes and avoiding every neighborhood function like they were minefields. Her garden was immaculate. Her social life? Less so. But the dock's legend didn't just remain in our tiny lake community. The local news feature went viral, somehow. Maybe it was Steve and his megaphone flamingo stunt. Maybe it was the drone footage of Karen screaming as the dock glided off into the sunset like a slow-motion power move. Whatever it was, the story hit a nerve. People from other neighborhoods started reaching out, asking for copies of our revised bylaws, tips on surviving their own HOA dictatorships, and most hilariously, instructions on building a floating dock with a detachable anchoring system. I put together a free PDF titled "Float Your Way to Freedom" and threw in a few bourbon cocktail recipes just for flair. The emails kept coming. So did the appreciation. One guy in Ohio even mailed me a custom t-shirt that said, "HOA stands for Hop Off Ashley." No idea who Ashley is, but I respect the hustle. Eventually, my dock inspired a mini movement online. People started sharing their own stories of HOA absurdity, and we all laughed, cried, and bonded over tales of fine happy Karens and backyard vigilantes. A podcast invited me to speak. A subreddit made me a mod. At one point, someone even suggested I write a book. Maybe I will. The Drift That Shook the Shore, a memoir of bourbon, bolts, and HOA battles. Bestseller material? Probably not. Therapeutic? Absolutely. But more than any viral attention or fleeting internet fame, what mattered most to me was the community that now thrived where pettiness once ruled. We kept growing. We added community gardens, voluntary, not policed. We started a monthly Dock Talk series where neighbors could rant, vent, or just tell stories while passing around a bottle. We set up a community boat library where people could check out waterproof books and float while reading. The HOA now ran with a rotating leadership model, one that required majority community input before implementing anything more serious than a bake sale flyer. No more rulers, just stewards. No more threats, just suggestions. The dock was still mine, still private, but now it served everyone by choice. And no one dared lay a single wedding decoration on it without asking. Every once in a while, someone new would move in and ask, "Hey, what's with the dock?" And we'd tell them. We'd tell them about the wedding, the drift, the legal beatdown, the community coup, and the rise of #DockBoss. And their eyes would light up, not with fear or suspicion, but with awe. They realized they weren't just joining a neighborhood, they were joining a story, a living myth, a floating monument to saying no to petty tyranny and yes to living your damn life. And so the dock floats on, anchored in both the lake and in legend, part structure, part symbol, all heart.